Hello and welcome to Renderosity's continuing tutorial series on POSER 10 and POSER Pro 2014. I'm Mark Bremer, and in this movie we will be looking at the materials editor, how you change the colors of things inside of POSER. Now I have to do a quid pro quo here, and just a fair warning. The materials editor in POSER is fantastic, and it's also very complex because of that complexity, or the ability to create lots of real world surfaces. There are many options that I'm not going to take the time to explore today, but I do want to give you a top level down and a way to consider approaching not only just basic material types of functions, which we will with like this ball in front of us, but how you can go into the characters themselves that already have texture maps and things like that and start changing the nature of them because of a little involvement in the material editor. So with this done, let's go into our material room itself by clicking on the tab and take a look at it. Now POSER uses, let me go ahead and collapse this with a little icon right here. POSER uses a function called node-based editing. It's a super way to do it. In fact, POSER was one of the first 3D programs to use this method of creating and managing materials. It allows you to create sub-materials out here or sub-functions and simply plug them into the master editor right here to get your desired effect. Let me expand this a little bit. We've got some little plugs along here, and this is where we would plug in, for example, on a character, a texture map. Well, let's explain these colors real quickly, or I shouldn't say colors, let's explain some of these items here and give you an idea of how they work and how to consider approaching them. Diffuse color is simply the color of the object. It's the diffuse or the pure default value. If I change this to something like blue, we'll see our scene update right here. And then we've got another option underneath that called diffuse value. Now, any color, you can approach the color as the hue, has the ability to be either toned or tinted. Think about a copy machine. What do you put in a copy machine? Toner, because it's black. So if I reduce this right here by a factor of, say, half, so I make it 0.5, I'm toning the color down. It's becoming darker. It's the same blue, it's just a darker version of the blue. If I take the same thing and say 1.5 and increase it by a value of a half, then I have tinted this color or turned it lighter by white. This is valuable when you start working with texture maps and characters because you can actually go ahead and change the character of the skin color by toning and tinting. Really easy to add some ethnicity or some changes of color if you want to. Now, specular color is this little highlight right here when the light shines on the object. Usually you'd want to leave it as white. Sometimes for special effects you can change that. If I was making a bubble here instead of a ball, there's some cool things we can do with some cellular mixers to create these, you know how colors change across a bubble? Pretty fun stuff. But more important than the specular color right here and the value, which is just like the diffuse value, is the highlight size. Now the human eye interprets the size of this highlight to give you a quick estimation of how smooth an object is. The broader the object right here, or I should say the broader the highlight, the less shiny the object is. Right now it's got a value of 0.1. If I go ahead and change this to 0.001, then we get these little teeny spots of white light, and we immediately view that as being super shiny. For characters, sometimes this comes into play with the aid of texture maps to help skin look like it's wet, because when skin is dry it's got that diffuse type of highlight to it, but when it's wet or if it's oily or there's some kind of liquid on the skin, the highlights become very small, which just helps you interpret that as going, oh, I see what's going on, this person is sweating or whatever it may be. Now when we get down to ambient color, those are the areas around us. Transparency, usually you will always have this set to 0 unless you actually want to see into or through an object, or in the case of characters, the eyebrows, the eyelashes, things like that actually have transparency maps typically plugged in to reveal a color and then hide the rest. Continuing down the list here, we've got reflection, and that's just what you would think for both color and value as well. Refraction gets into things you don't normally deal with characters, but looking through glass. So these would be scene props and items like that. Now, bump and displacement are items that are sometimes applied to characters, sometimes not. They are always applied to props if the props are going to look real. Let me show you what I mean right here, and we'll add a node and make it work. I'm simply in this open area here going to right click, add a new node. I'm going to come down to, let's see, if we go to 2D textures, let's go ahead and grab something like tile. Now this comes in right here, and we've got colors in here. Now the only place colors have an effect is in specular areas or diffuse color areas. When we get down to bump over here, the bump map or the bump function doesn't care about colors, it only cares about white and black. So to make this work, what I'm going to do is change this to white and change tile 2 to black. I'm not going to change any of the other items right here, or the mortar thickness of the tile, or the irregularity with turbulence, how fuzzy it is. I'm simply going to take this ability right here, click and drag and plug this into bump. With that plugged in, all of a sudden I have a value shows up that says 0.08, and I'm not going to adjust that at this time. Now looking at the preview, nothing's changed. So let's go ahead and render this. And this is where working with materials takes a little bit of time. It's constant rendering to see how it's turned out. With this done, with the bump engaged, we can say, wow, look at this. We've got it looks like a metal ball right now that's been put together with squares of metal, and it's fairly shiny and painted. Your eye interprets this very quickly. Now, if we disconnect this, I'm going to click on the plugin right here and say disconnect. I'm going to bring this down now, not to bump, but to displacement. This will actually change the geometry of the object. Let's re-render. We can see now that we've got a very, very different looking item, and in fact I can take this and plug this into bump also. If we render once again, we'll see that we get additional details, crispness to the edges in here, just some light and dark. So it's very easy with just a few clicks to go ahead and start totally changing the character of an item in the materials room. Well, this is great, but let's see how it applies to characters, because that's really where we spend most of our time. Typically when you get scenes like something from stonemason or something like that, the bump maps and everything's been built, it's plugged in, you really don't have to mess around with it. But let's take a look at a character and see how you might modify the characteristics of the materials room to change a character. I'll close this because we don't need it anymore and create a new scene. We'll get rid of our good friend Andy in here, and let's come over to our characters and load in Ryan Casual. Looking quite stylish in his red boxers, if I remember correctly. There we go. Well, let's zoom in kind of close here so we can see what's going on. And I'm going to move in my scene just a touch here, orbit around, and zoom in kind of close. And let's look at what's going on with a render right here, and then take a look and deconstruct it in the materials room real briefly. So I'm going to hit render, thinks about it for just a second, calculates all the lights, and you know what? There is not enough light there for us to see what's going on. Let me move this around, and we'll render that again. I just grabbed the light and moved it. If you'd like to know more about lights, check out the lighting tutorial that comes with this. So we have some details in the nose, and most of the detail we're seeing right here is born or handled by a texture map, a photo of skin that has been put together very carefully. We can see individual eyelashes, but this is where a map is being applied to the transparency channel. The color is black in the transparency channel, and it's using a texture to only show just little bits of it. Same thing going for the eyebrow up above. Let's hop into the materials room. Now, the last thing I touched in the pose room happened to be a light. To readjust that, so in the materials room we are seeing a light show up where we could change the color. Now our lighting controls let us change it right down here if we wanted to, but that is actually controlled in the materials room. So how do we get back over to Ryan, our character? Well, we come back to the top selector here and come down to Ryan. Obviously there's Ryan, and then there are some running shorts that are connected to him, so I'll select him here, and the first thing it opens is the material of the body. Ryan's made up of a bunch of parts, and if we click on the material, we see that we actually have separate materials for everything here. Why so many? Well, the body is a single texture map, and we can get away with some kind of low resolution or lower resolution types of maps right here, where the entire body is contained in a single map. These little items over here are typically fingernails, toenails. We see the arms spread out. It's actually kind of gruesome to look at, but the technical term for it is that the 3D model has been unwrapped for the UV mapping to take place, and then these are hand painted. So skin textures, photos have been applied in something like Photoshop, a map's given and it's applied to the body. Now the same texture map is probably used in several areas, but there are different texture maps being used. For example, if we come up to material, and let's come down to eyeball right. Now this is going to be the character's right eyeball, which should be this one right here, not the right as we look at the scene. We've got a single texture map just for eyes. Why? Well, we've learned over time, and we being the whole 3D community of which you are a part, that people look at eyes on characters more than anything else. They're willing to accept visually less information on skin, but eyes, we want to see crisp reflections, we want to see little blood veins, things like that. It increases the believability or the realism of the character with high resolution eye maps. So that's what we have going on here. This has been plugged in to the diffuse color. Now, to get a pure or complete faithful interpretation of a texture map into the scene right here, the diffuse color needs to be set to white. If we want Ryan to be coming back in from a night of drinking, well, we can actually add a little bit of pink to his eye or a little bit of red. Let's come over here and release that, and we see his eye update over there. And man, that guy's been out too late. I bring this up because you can do the same thing with teeth. You can do the same thing with skin tone. We can be changing the ethnicity of Ryan, and we can make him look like he's been staying out too late by simply modifying some of the basic functions of the material here. Let's come back to body. Again, we've got this white diffuse color in here, which is making sure that the texture map is being imported faithfully. Now you'll notice that we are missing a head here. The skin over a majority of the body is, well, the lower resolution. If we happen to come up here, and I'm sure we can track down head, we'll see a texture map that's specific only to the head. It's got more resolution, and so we are seeing, we want to see the pores, we want to see the freckles, all those things when we zoom into face close-ups. And of course for the interior of the mouth here we have the tongue. If we want to change Ryan's ethnicity a little bit, well, we can do that, but here's where we need to pay close attention to some of the color values, because since we're using multiple maps, you can change the head and have the head suddenly not match the rest of the body. Maybe that's a look you want, but typically it's not. So if we say, let's go ahead and make our character look like he's a little bit more of, say, a Mediterranean descent, well, we can actually tone the skin just a little bit, which will blend with the texture map. Now that's too orange as far as I'm concerned, so let's just come down here and we can darken this up just a little bit. And darken the skin a little bit. So it's very easy to use some of the basic functions on the master node right here to modify other nodes that get plugged into it. Now you'll notice that on the diffuse or the face, should say the head material, there's no bump map, and this character comes without one. Some characters do have bump maps, and it's typically a grayscale or a black and white type of texture that is simply plugged into the bump channel. Sometimes those are also plugged into the specular color channel to reveal highlights. Some wet texture maps that are made specifically to make the character look wet take the body type of texture or the head texture, convert it to black and white, and then it's been illustrated on top of to reveal kind of like rivulets of water running down. So some really cool ways to start working with the top level editor or materials editor inside of POSER to modify even existing content. If we wanted to make Ryan smile, we could turn his teeth a slight shade of yellow. We could grunge them up just a little bit. There are so many options of adding different nodes here, and again, this is why I could spend probably about 5 hours going over materials tutorials, ways to blend different items together. For glass, or I'd mentioned bubbles earlier, Fresnel blends, which changes how reflection and color are perceived across an object. Really, really cool stuff. But for a real basic level, just to recap, every item in POSER has a master materials node. Into that node you can plug others. When a node has been plugged in, you can modify how it is read or understood by POSER by changing the basic functions in the master node right here. Just cool stuff. You're going to have fun. It's a very, very nice way to extend the texture maps that come with stock characters. You're going to have a blast working with materials in the material room of POSER.